So I bet probably wherever you guys are, you can find some from Weinhesthoff and Abbey as well and taste it. And one of the beers they sell is this one called the 1516 Keller beer. And you might wonder, if they opened in 1040, wouldn't it make more sense to have a beer called the 1040 year? Like, what happened in 1516 that they make a beer for that? And 1516 is actually a very, very important year in beer history. And that's because that was a year that a law called the Bavarian Purity Law was passed. And this law today is still the foundation of what we think of as beer today. So what this law said is that beer was only allowed to have 3 ingredients: water, obviously, barley, and hops. You weren't allowed to put any fruit in it, any spices in it, any herbs in it, any rice, any corn, only barley, water, and hops. And this still really is how we define beer today. So for instance, I don't know about the Canadian laws, but the American laws still declares that for something to be legally sold as a beer, it has to have at least 25% barley, and it has to have hops in it as well. So that means if any of you guys are fans of wheat beers, even though they're called wheat beers, they have at least 25% barley in them still. And sometimes they have as much as 70% barley and just a little bit, 30% wheat. But in archaeological terms, 1040, 1516, all of this is quite recent. And we're going to go back way, way further. So this is some of the diversity of the types of beer you can get today. You know, what do we mean when we say beer? How would we define the word beer? There are all kinds of beers you could get today. You could get ales, lagers, IPAs, stouts, porters, pilsners. And all of these, even though they have a really wide range of tastes and colors, they all are based on that fundamental barley, water, and hops. And of course, now that we know a bit more about how brewing works, we know they all have yeast in them as well, which is a microscopic creature we were not able to see back in 1516. Also, all the alcohol we drink, not just beer, but for wine or for cider or for mead as well, they are all based on ethanol, which is a scientific name. They all share the same kind of alcohol. So they all have this ethanol in them, the scientific name for alcohol. They all have hops, which gives them their bitter flavor and their preservation. And they all have barley as kind of the main base of what they are based on. But if we were to look outside just the modern Western beers, and if we were to look back over the many, many tens of thousands of years of archaeology we're going to get into, beer comes in a much wider diversity than you're likely to find at your local bar. So technically, the real definition of beer is not barley, water, and hops, any fermented cereal or any fermented starch. So it doesn't have to be barley. It could be potatoes, it could be corn, it could be rice, it could be all kinds of things. And this picture shows you a couple of traditional beers that are made around the world today. And you can see how they look very, very different from what you saw in the previous photo. So this one here in the middle, this is a traditional beer called sati that is made up in the Scandinavian countries. It dates back to the Viking age, and it is made of rye and juniper. This is one called chicha, made out of corn that is made in Central and South America. This is a millet beer made in China. This is a rice beer made in South India. And this is a beer based on sorghum made in South Africa. So wine, on the other hand, is any fermented alcohol made out of a fruit. So one thing you might notice right now, a lot of you guys probably have had sake at some point. Sake is based on rice. It's usually translated as rice wine, though, and not rice beer, even though obviously rice is a grain and not a fruit. And the reason why we translate it that way is because sake has a higher alcohol level than most beers. It's kind of more up in the wine range. So even though sake is technically a beer because it's based on rice, a grain, we very often call it a wine just because it has that high level of alcohol. That also means that cider or perry, which is a pear-based cider, apples and pears are both fruits, so those are both technically wines. And then the third kind of alcohol that exists is mead, which is based off of honey. So again, all of these are huge diversity in the types of sources humans throughout history and across the globe have used to make beer and to make other kinds of alcohol as well. So which is the oldest one? Well, it is definitely older than written records, which makes it hard to put an exact date on. But we can make some good guesses. The oldest alcohol probably is mead. Mead has a quite good claim for the oldest alcohol. And that is because when all you have to do to make mead is to have some honey, have some water, and leave it alone in warm temperatures for a few days. And you can imagine how this could quite naturally happen in the wild without even any human intervention. You know, say you have a beehive that is abandoned from the bees for one reason or another. Maybe it gets knocked down out of a tree due to a storm. Maybe a bear comes along and knocks it down. It's laying on the ground, it rains, some water gets in there, mixes with the honey, and is left alone for a few days somewhere where there are warm temperatures. And then you can imagine an early human coming along and seeing that beehive on the ground and thinking, hey, I like to eat honey. Here's some free honey. And as he or she consumes it, notices, oh, this honey tastes a little different than usual. Oh, wow, it's making me feel really good. I really like the effect this fermented honey is having. And it would be very, very easy for early humans then to recreate that and not just find it in the wild, but to do it on purpose themselves. And we do have evidence that humans were interested in gathering honey at a very, very early date. You can see from these two cave paintings, one in Africa, one in Europe, many, many thousands of years ago, where we are, both of them are showing humans gathering honey from a beehive. Now, we don't know for sure they would use the honey they gathered to make mead versus just to eat it as plain honey, but because it is so simple to make mead, it seems unlikely that they wouldn't do that at least some of the time. Another candidate for the very earliest alcohol is a thing called toddy, or it's also called palm wine. And this is still made today, although it's pretty rare here in the West. And this is made from the palm tree. Different kinds of palm tree, could be a coconut palm, date palm, whatever kind of palm tree. And palm trees have a very, very sugary sap. So it's kind of like maple trees. When you cut a maple tree and the sap that comes out is very, very sugary, it can be turned into maple syrup. It's kind of the same thing with palm trees, but because while maple trees grow up where it's fairly cold, of course, palm trees grow in tropical regions. And again, when this sap comes out due to any sort of reason, a branch breaks off, a storm, an animal, and if that sap was to collect in a bit of water and wait for a day or two in warm temperatures, it will naturally ferment and it will become this toddy or this palm wine. So it's very easy to see how humans, early humans, could have stumbled across this and quickly discovered how to make it for themselves. And when I say early humans, I'm not even necessarily talking about Homo sapiens, our own species. I'm talking about earlier hominids as well, quite likely were aware of alcohol and occasionally consumed it. So I wanted to show you guys this brief video. There we go, showing a wild chimpanzee. He has discovered one of these toddy pools where the palm sap is fermenting. And as you can see, he is definitely quite interested in what he has found. He's not even just taking one experimental taste, but he's coming back for more and more. So it definitely looks like the appeal of alcohol goes way, way back in the human tree. Now, all of that is logical. You know, it makes sense that mead or toddy would be the earliest alcohol. But what is the earliest one we actually have evidence for? And for that, we have to go to a site called Jiahu, which is in China. Jiahu is one of the oldest farming villages in the world. They farmed rice there. Some of the other interesting things about it is one of the sites that has evidence for the oldest pet dogs in the world as well. So it's kind of a pretty important site. And another thing that Jiahu has is some very, very early pottery. And this pottery is important because this is not like the kind of pottery you guys drink your coffee out of. This is not porcelain. This is terracotta. So it's much more similar to if you have a terracotta flower pot. And as you might notice, when you water your plants, some of that water goes into the terracotta pot itself. It kind of absorbs some of the water. And that's what this pottery would do as well. When liquids were put into them, some of that would get absorbed into the clay walls. And because of that, we are actually able to do chemical analyses of these clay walls to find out what sorts of liquids were stored in this pottery. So this is probably not the earliest alcohol. It's just before people had pottery, it's very hard to get at any evidence of that alcohol until they began putting it in pots where we could chemically analyze the remains left behind in the pots. So first of all, we can tell just by looking at these pots, one of the things archaeologists do is by looking at the shape of a pot, tells us a little bit about what was stored in them. And as you can see, these all have pretty narrow necks, which tells us that probably what was stored in them was liquid or something else that you can pour. You probably wouldn't store like firewood in a pot like this. You wouldn't store like cuts of meat because with those narrow necks, it makes it hard to get your hands in to pick up whatever's in them. So it's probably something you can tip and pour, which is pretty good evidence of it being most likely a liquid. But as I said, we can also look at the chemical analysis. And when archaeologists did a chemical analysis of these Jiahu pots, the first thing they found was phytosterol ferulate esters, which is, I'm sure you guys all already know, is the chemical evidence left behind by rice. As I said, that makes sense. We know this was a farming village. We know what they were farming was rice. So it makes a lot of sense that their beer would be based on rice as opposed to some other grain that would have been quite exotic and hard to get for them. The next thing we found was beeswax, which is probably more evidence of honey rather than beeswax itself, because it is actually impossible to entirely strain all the wax out of honey. And the third thing we found was a chemical called Tetoric Acid. And Tetoric Acid is found in a lot of different fruits and berries. In this case, based on what grows in this area, probably a thing called the hawthorn tree, which looks like this. It's described as having a taste that's kind of like a mix of sweet and sour. So in these jars, we had a rice-based beer, a mead-based honey, and a fruit-based wine, all kind of mixed together into a single drink. So this is the total opposite of what we do today. Today, things that are single origin or that advertise how short their ingredient lists are very, very popular. But it seems like back at the time of Jiahu, people were kind of instead mixing together a lot of different sources. And this mixing together of a lot of different ingredients seems to have been very common throughout most of the early alcohols, early beers or wines or whatever you want to call them, cocktails maybe. And the reason why this seems to be very common is we actually have a very, very similar recipe from another site far in the future and far in distance. So we're going from China at 7000 BCE, and we're going to jump ahead to 700 BCE, so 6,000 years in the future, and to the site of Gordian, which is located in what is modern day Turkey. So you guys might be thinking you've never heard of the city of Gordian, but I bet you actually have. I bet you've heard of the story of the Gordian Knot, which took place here in the city of Gordian. So Gordian, we're no longer talking about farming villages. This was a big, big city. It had a wall all the way around it with towers, and there was a huge palace in the center of the city where the king lived. And according to legend, one day early in the history of the city, they didn't have a king, and the people wanted to have a king. So there was a prophet, and he declared that the next person to enter the city gate driving an ox cart, that person should be made their king. And it happened that the next person to come in driving an ox cart was a guy named Gordius. He was nobody special. He was just a farmer, but he was declared king. The city of Gordian was named after the guy Gordius. He was a very good king, and after he died, his son became king, and his son was a guy named Midas. You probably also heard the story of King Midas with the golden touch. He probably did not really have the power to turn things into gold, but he was a real person and he was very, very rich, which is probably where that story comes from. So Midas wanted to honor his father, and he built a temple around that ox cart his dad had been driving when he was declared king. And in the temple, he tied the ox cart to a pole. Now, many centuries went by, about 4 centuries went by. And in the 300s, a guy named Alexander the Great arrived in the city of Gordian. And by this time, 400 years had passed, and this ox cart had been sitting in that temple the whole time. And the knot attaching the ox cart had, solidified, it had aged, it had become pretty much impossible to untie. And a legend had sprang up saying anyone who was able to untie this knot, which became known as the Gordian Knot, would become the ruler of all of Asia. And Alexander the Great, he was a pretty ambitious guy. He wanted to fulfill this prophecy. He wanted to become the ruler of all of Asia. So he went to the temple and he saw the Gordian Knot. But when he looked at it, he realized it would be too difficult even for him to untie. So he took out his sword and he cut right through it. And supposedly that was close enough. He didn't untie it, but he did break. He did separate the Gordian Knot. And he was supposed to fulfill the prophecy. He didn't actually become the ruler of all of Asia, but he did conquer more of it than anyone had done previously. So you guys are probably familiar with those stories, and that is how you might have heard of the city of Gordian. So the rulers of Gordian, the kings of Gordian, including the first Gordius and his son Midas, when they died, they would be buried in these massive burial mounds outside the city. They're kind of like pyramids, but built out of just dirt, out of soil, instead of being built out of stone or bricks. This is the biggest of them. It is 17 stories high, and this is probably where Gordius himself is buried. So at the bottom of this huge earthen mound, there was a wooden chamber, and that is where his actual body was. This is a reconstruction based on the skull of what he might have looked like. And in this wooden chamber, in addition to just the body, he was buried with all kinds of valuable objects called grave goods. He was buried in a set of very, very fancy, very rich clothing. And he also had set up in the chamber with him all the equipment you would need to give a massive feast, a feast for about 100 people. There were wooden tables and benches and chairs. The wood has all since collapsed. In the almost 3,000 years since then, you can just kind of see the piles of sawdust left. In addition, whole bunches of plates and bowls. This was a drinking cup you would use. Jars, all the things you would need to have a feast. Kind of ironically, though, nothing was made out of gold, despite, Midas having the golden touch. All of this was actually made out of bronze. So here's a reconstruction of what it might have looked like when it was new. And in addition to the single serving dishes and bowls, we had quite large copper vessels where the food and the drink was stored before it was passed out to the people invited to this feast. And at the bottom of these copper vessels, we found the very, very faint remains, just kind of dust now, of what had been served at this feast. And again, we were able to do chemical analyses of this dust. And what we found was quite similar to what was found 6,000 years earlier in Jiahu. Again, we found that Tetoric acid, based on what was growing in Turkey versus what grows in China, probably grapes. We found, again, beeswax, evidence that they mixed honey in as well. And we did not find rice, but instead we found a chemical called calcium oxalate. If any of you guys are home brewers, I know somebody mentioned they were from a brewing company. You might also know this chemical as beer stone. And this is a chemical that is left behind when you are dealing with barley. So instead of rice, we have barley. And in addition, this dust had a very intense yellow color. So the archaeologists suggested they might have flavored it with saffron, a spice that is known for having a very, very kind of bright yellowy orangey color. And that was very commonly grown and very commonly used in Turkey at the time. So again, just like in Jiahu, we have a mix of a grain-based alcohol plus a mead plus a fruit-based alcohol. So like wine and beer and mead all mixed together. And this recipe actually is what Dogfish Head Brewery based their beer Midas Touch on. I see Matt just said he likes Midas Touch. I don't know if any of you other guys were able to get a Midas Touch for yourself, but that recipe is actually based on the discoveries at this funeral mound for King Gordius. They named it after his son Midas instead of calling it the Gordius Touch, because most people have probably not heard of Gordius. It's also been adjusted a bit for modern taste. It does have some hops in it, for example, but it is still based on barley plus grapes plus honey plus a bit of saffron, inspired by this ancient site. By the way, in the other vessels, some of these vessels had this alcoholic drink and some of them had the food. So if you wanted to know what the ideal accompaniment to Midas Touch is, what they served at this funeral feast was a lentil and goat stew. So that's what I would recommend pairing with your Midas Touch. But so for over such a long period of time and in two such different places, we see people mixing grain and fruit and honey. So why did they do that? Why would that be so common? And to understand that, we need to look a bit at the science of beer. So as I mentioned to you guys, beer is all based on yeast. Yeast is a living creature. It's a microscopic organism, but it's not a bacteria. It's not a virus. It's actually more closely related to animals, to you and me, than it is to bacteria. So it's like a very tiny single-celled animal. And what yeast does is it eats sugar and then it poops out alcohol and carbon dioxide. And the reason why it does this is sugar is a very valuable food source. And by producing alcohol, alcohol kills most other microorganisms that might want to come and eat that sugar for themselves. So by producing the alcohol, the yeast is kind of protecting itself. It's killing off all of its competitors and making sure all the sugar is only left for the yeast. Alcohol, ethanol, is technically a poison. If we were to jump into an entire swimming pool of it ourselves, it would be quite dangerous, but humans have found that just a little bit of this poison makes us feel quite good. It does make some carbon dioxide, not enough to the levels that most drinkers today really prefer. So most of the carbon dioxide you're drinking in beer today has actually been added in after the effect, because yeast doesn't really make that much carbon dioxide. For a very, very long time, because yeast is microscopic, people did not know that that was where the alcohol was coming from. It wasn't until 1680 that someone saw a yeast for the first time under a microscope. And it wasn't until Louis Pasteur in 1860 that he finally figured out what the yeast was actually doing, and that yeast was a living creature and not just like a weird tiny rock or something like that. The specific kind of yeast that we use in most beers, there's a few beers that use different kinds of yeast, but the vast majority of beers use a species called Saccharomyces cerevisiae. And this is actually also the same kind of yeast that is used in making bread. So when we are making beer, we want this yeast primarily for the alcohol, and the carbon dioxide is kind of a nice side effect. When you're making bread, it's just the reverse. The carbon dioxide is the main effect, because those bubbles are what makes bread rise, is what makes it light and fluffy. And then the alcohol burns off during the baking process. This Saccharomyces cerevisiae is very, very common. It is in the air around us. It is carried by insects. It is very, very common all around the environment. And if you guys have ever made sourdough, you might have experienced that, where if you just leave flour out in the open, naturally wild yeast, including Saccharomyces cerevisiae, will end up landing on that wet flour you've left out and beginning to ferment the sugars found in it. So yeast is all over the place, but some of the places we can particularly find the Saccharomyces cerevisiae in large amounts is that it grows on the skin of a lot of fruits, including especially grapes and apples. It also grows in the stomachs of bees. So although ancient people wouldn't have known it, by adding in fruit and by adding in honey, they would have also been adding in yeast. They would have found that mixing a grain plus a wine, plus a fruit, plus honey together leads to greater fermentation, even though they didn't know why, but they would have found that it had this effect. In fact, the word yeast comes from the ancient Proto-Indo-European for a word that means to boil or to froth. Because one of the most visible pieces of evidence when you added in this yeast, even though you can't see the yeast itself because it's microscopic, you very quickly would have seen the effect of the bubbles of carbon dioxide coming up. You guys might have experienced this yourself. If you have ever bought unpasteurized apple cider or grape juice from a farmer's market, and you brought it home and you didn't drink it quickly enough, you might have found that after about a week in your refrigerator, it starts to taste a little different. It starts to get a little bubbly. Maybe the jar it's in gets kind of poofed out. That is because the natural yeast on the grape skin or the apple skins is beginning to ferment the sugars in it. It's just taken a longer time because you probably stored it in your refrigerator where it's much cooler. If you were to store it at room temperature, this effect could be seen sometimes within as quickly as 10 minutes. If the yeast has plenty of sugar and it's a quite warm, 70 or 80 degree day, you can see this quite quickly. So again, although ancient people wouldn't have known all of the biology and chemistry behind it, they could have quite easily figured out what led to these steps. There's one more step that really has to go into making beer specifically, though. So beer is based on a grain, whether that's rice or whether that's barley or whatever other grain. And grains have starches, not sugars. So we have to first convert that starch to a sugar so it becomes accessible to the yeast. And the way people have done this throughout most of history is by letting the grain begin to grow just a little bit, just for a day or two to get to kind of this level of growth. And this is called germinating. And what this does is when a grain begins to germinate, it releases enzymes that convert its starches into sugars. And it does this because a grain is a seed for a barley plant or a rice plant or whatever it is. And as it just begins to grow, it's not able to begin feeding on sunlight yet because it doesn't have any leaves yet. And to get the energy to grow that very first leaf and that very first root, it has to rely on the energy within the grain itself that it was kind of planted with. So those enzymes convert the starches into a sugar so the baby plant can use that sugar for energy to build its first leaf and its first root. But if you allow it just to grow a tiny bit like this and then stop it, we can use that sugar for ourselves, whether that is to make beer or some other purpose. This germination is also called malt or malting. It means the same thing. And you guys might have heard of this if you have had malted chocolate balls or if you've had a malted milkshake. This is the exact same thing. You usually will find malt in sweet things like chocolate, like milkshakes, because again, this is releasing the sugars, so usually sweet products. But it is also used to make beer where the yeast needs those sugars to eat. Now you can germinate any grain. You can germinate rice, you can germinate corn, whatever you're working with, you can germinate. But it happens that barley is really good at making this malt. That barley happens to be the one that releases the best kind of enzyme that is most efficient at converting the starches to sugars. And in fact, barley is so good at this that if you mix barley with, say, wheat, some of the barley enzymes will even help the wheat convert its starches to sugars as well. And that is why barley has come to dominate making beer over any other grain, because it just happens that it makes the most of these enzymes. It doesn't mean you can't make beer with any other grain. It just means barley is the most efficient. It's kind of the best evolved for this particular use. So how did ancient humans discover this? Well, to talk about that, we need to kind of talk about the beginning of human history. We have to go way back to the very beginning to talk about the beginning of beer. And I am an archaeologist. We're having this event for Oklahoma Archaeology Month. And when you ask an archaeologist, when does human history begin? The answer you're going to get is usually about 2.5 million years ago. If you asked a historian, if you asked a geologist, you would get different numbers. But as an archaeologist, we're going to say 2.5 million years ago. Why that date? Because that is when we have the very oldest stone tools. So that is when we have the very oldest evidence of people doing something, of people making something. So we can't just look at the skeletons, but we can actually begin to look at people's behavior and the sorts of things they did, the sorts of things they've made. So that's when archaeologists date the beginning of human history too. Now, the beginning of farming did not happen until about 12,000 years ago. The time period when farming begins is called the Neolithic. I don't want to make you guys learn a lot of jargon, but Neolithic is one really important term you can come away with having learned a little bit of archaeology. So again, the Neolithic means when farming began. And as I said, that happened about 12,000 years ago. So the vast majority of human history, from 2.5 million years ago to 12,000 years ago, we had no farming. People were not farming. People were hunter-gatherers. They were mostly nomadic. They moved from place to place, following different plants as they came into season, following different animals that they could hunt. But when farming was invented, everything really begins to change. The Neolithic and farming is absolutely fundamental to modern life as we know it today. For example, without farming, we could not have cities, because cities inherently have more people than the area of the city is able to feed. A city, by definition, has to be bringing resources in from outside, which means those outside areas have to be overproducing resources. And the only way they can overproduce resources enough is through farming. So for instance, it's estimated in the United States today that it takes about one farmer to feed 155 people. So that one farmer who lives on the farm provides for 155 people who live in the city and who do not have to produce their own food themselves. Agriculture is also fundamental to what we call specialized crafts. So if you have literally any job other than producing food, if you are a teacher, if you are a painter, if you are a carpenter, a blacksmith, a mechanic, a potter, a clothing maker, a priest, a bureaucrat, a politician, every single job that is not directly producing food is only possible because that farmer is overproducing food to make all of these other specialized crafts possible. So without farming, we wouldn't have cities, we wouldn't have all the various technologies people have become specialized in, we wouldn't have the pyramids, we wouldn't have palaces, we wouldn't have basically every single thing that we rely on today and that we consider a basic part of life today. But those people right here at 12,000 years ago, of course, they couldn't see the future. They couldn't know of what would come from inventing farming. So one of the really big questions in archaeology is, why did people invent farming? Why did these people here decide to change from what humans had been doing for millions of years to decide to stop being hunter-gatherers and begin to be farmers? What happened at that moment 12,000 years ago that suddenly the way of life for humans totally changed? By the way, looking at this timeline, this asterisk I put here is when our own species, when Homo sapiens evolved. So some people think that the only species who can like make tools or have fire or do other interesting things was ourselves, but a lot of our ancestors could do that as well, because we ourselves did not evolve until about 300,000 years ago. So another thing you might have heard, if any of you guys are familiar with the paleo diet, is this belief that people before the Neolithic, before farming, did not eat wild grains or wild cereals at all. This is totally not true. The paleo diet is based on nothing in archaeology. It is made up as far as the archaeology side is. I can't comment on the nutritionist, dietitian side, but as far as the history goes, it's nonsense. Of course, people back in the hunter-gatherer days ate wild cereals and wild grains when they came across a field of ripe wild cereals. Because why wouldn't you? Why would you come across some wild wheat or some wild barley and just ignore it? That would be a very dumb decision. So of course, people back before the Neolithic did eat wild cereals and wild grains. How did they eat them? They didn't make bread because ovens hadn't been invented yet. And you can't eat grains raw. It's very bad for your teeth. It's pretty bad for your digestive system. So you do have to make something into it. So what did these very early people make out of these wild grains? Well, they made what you might call gruel, which is basically just some wild grains plus hot water. Very, very simple. But to make it sound a little nicer, because nobody has ever wanted to eat gruel, we can basically call the same thing porridge or congee or oatmeal or grits. All of these are basically just a grain plus hot water with maybe some flavorings in it as well. So very, very simple to make, very easier to eat, easier to digest than trying to chew on raw wheat or raw rice or whatever it is. And once people have discovered gruel, it is a very short hop to two other important discoveries. The first one is flatbreads. So things like pita or tortilla or naan, which is basically just gruel cooked on, in this case, obviously they're using a metal instrument, but for the early people, they might just put it on a flat rock and cook it that way. So very, very simple. Doesn't take a lot of extra steps once you're gathering wild grains to get to flatbreads. But another thing that would be very, very easy to get to and that would not take a lot of extra steps would be an early form of beer. So you can imagine if someone has made a pot of gruel and for whatever reason, they don't eat the whole thing on the first day. Maybe they forgot about it. Maybe something else came up. Maybe it got stuck in a corner and nobody saw it there. Again, you would have those sugars in it. You would have that warm water. And within, yeast would come from the environment. So within just a few days, that gruel would begin to become noticeably bubbly and noticeably taste different as the yeast fermented it into an alcohol. And if these early people came across that gruel a couple of days later and decided to eat it, they would notice this different taste. They would notice the effects on their mood, on their senses, and they might enjoy it. So both these flatbreads and beer are very, very easy inventions that people would have quite easily come up with even before farming. And one of the big debates in archaeology is which of these came first, bread or beer. You might not thought of beer as being an important archaeological discovery, but it really is. And this debate, bread or beer, has come to kind of symbolize a bigger debate in archaeology about why farming was invented, why the Neolithic began. And that is, did people become farmers because they had to, because they no longer could hunt and gather enough food, that maybe the human population was rising, maybe climate change caused previous wild plants to no longer be as available, that hunter-gatherers were beginning to starve. And the only way they could survive was by turning to farming. That's the bread side of the debate. The other side of the debate is that hunter-gatherers were doing fine. They were taking care of themselves just as they had millions of years before. But they began to realize that sometimes it might be nice to have an extra storage of food that you could use to hold feasts or to hold big celebrations, or that you could use to pay other people to get them to work for you. And that one of the things in particular people might have really wanted to make, not needed to make, not because they were starving, but just wanted to make, was beer. And so the beer side of the debate is that humans chose to become farmers more for social reasons than they didn't have to. They weren't starving, but it was more of a social choice. So to try and answer this question, was it the bread that came first? Were people forced to become farmers? Or was it the beer that came first? Did they want to become farmers? We can look at this really interesting site called Goblet Tepe. It is located in what is modern day Turkey, and it dates to 9,500 BCE. So this is just a little tiny bit before the Neolithic, just a little tiny bit before farming began. These are some of the last generations of hunter-gatherers in this area. And Goblet Tepe, as you can see on this map, is located in what is called the Fertile Crescent. And the reason why this area is called the Fertile Crescent is because this is where the wild ancestors of wheat and rye and barley grew. So this is the area where you did not have to farm. You did not have to plant your own wheat or barley or rye. You could go out and find it in the wild because this was its natural habitat. Here's a picture of Goblet Tepe, a kind of bird's eye view looking down overhead. And as you notice, it is a bunch of stone pillars kind of arranged in circles. So you guys might be thinking of Stonehenge right away. This is much, much older than Stonehenge. Stonehenge dates to about 3000 BCE. And again, this is 9,500 BCE. So much, much older. Here's a couple other pictures of it. So you can see here's with some people. So you can get kind of the scale of quite how big these stone pillars are, about 20 feet high. They did not come from a very far way away. They were quarried just over the next hill, really only about 300 feet away. So they didn't have to move these stone pillars very far. But what is really interesting is the people at Goblet Tepe, they would make a circle of these stone pillars. And then a couple of decades later, 20 or 30 years later, they would bury it and they would build a new circle with new stone pillars right next to it. And they did this multiple times. Again and again, they would make a stone circle, use it for 20 or 30 years, then bury it and make a new one. Use that one for 20 and 30 years, bury it, make a new one, all on this same hill. So again, these guys, these are hunter-gatherers. These are nomadic people. These are not yet farmers. So this is not a village. They're not living at Goblet Tepe. They are going out nomadically. They are following the plants. They are following the animals. They're following the weather. And they're just coming here to Goblet Tepe occasionally to do this kind of weird thing, but there aren't any houses here. It's just these stone pillars. Here's some more pictures of the stone pillars. A lot of them have carvings of animals on them. We see here some snakes. This one is thought to be maybe a leopard or some kind of wild cat. Here we have a wild bull, a wild cattle, maybe a fox here, some kind of predator with a long tail, and a crane or some kind of bird with a long neck and long legs. A lot of the stone temples here is some snakes again, with maybe a spider or a scorpion here in the middle. And a lot of them actually have human carvings like this one does. It's kind of hard to see at first. So it's someone kind of standing like this. So you see here are the fingers at the front, and then the side of the arm is kind of going back on the side. And then this is a belt and a loincloth hanging down. So what is this? As I said, it's not a village. These aren't houses. There's no roof. There are all these different animals carved in it. So presumably this is a temple or some sort of religious or ritual site. And that is why they would come back to it over and over again, even though they weren't actually living here. And so what did they do when they came to Goblet Tepe? Well, we know one of the big things they did is that they had a feast. And we know this because we find a whole bunch of animal bones, wild animals, things like gazelle, wild cattle, wild donkeys, the sort of typical thing that hunters in the area would be some of the main animals they hunted. But we also found, in addition to a lot of animal processing, a lot of meat processing, people were gathering wild cereals and bringing it to Goblet Tepe as well. And the reason why we know that is we find these very large stone vessels. These are quite big. One of them could hold about 160 liters. So if you are a nomadic person, you would not want to be carrying this massive, massive stone vessel around with you from place to place. And we found in these stone vessels, when they did chemical analyses of the insides of them, they found that calcium oxalate, that beer stone, that is evidence of barley being processed in these stone vessels. Again, people aren't farming barley yet. They are just finding barley in the wild and bringing it back here. Now, we can't say for certain whether or not they were making like an oatmeal or whether they were making beer. But if you think about it, it makes a lot more sense that they would make beer. One of the reasons is that beer, especially unfiltered beer, because these early beers would have been thick and chunky, like the things we see in this picture. It wouldn't have been nice and clear like our beers today. And this kind of unfiltered beer is actually more nutritious than bread or than gruel is. And the reason why is because when you add in yeast, a lot of vegans today specifically eat yeast to get some of nutrients that a vegan diet has trouble including otherwise. So by including in the yeast, you would get things like protein, B vitamins, and amino acids. The alcohol would also help clean the water to fight against any bacteria that might be in the water. So it seems pretty likely that one of the things when these nomadic hunter-gatherers came to Goblet Tepe, one of the things they did here that would be hard for them to do other times of the year in other places was brew this early beer. Because again, having these massive stone vessels would be very hard as a nomadic people. Coming to this central location where they could leave these vessels would make it much, much easier. Another reason why we think it is more likely they were making beer than they were making oatmeal is because we have found these carvings where we have two people with kind of their arms up like this, and then they have a turtle in between them doing the same thing, turtle or a tortoise. And it is very, very common in the Middle East that a representation of people with their arms up like this means they're dancing. And you imagine people dancing, you're kind of more likely maybe to dance after you've had a drink of beer than after you've had a bowl of oatmeal, especially if you think about the kind of mind-altering properties of alcohol, and if you think turtles are dancing with you as well. So Goblet Tepe is a really interesting site because what we have here, again, these are people who are still hunter-gatherers, but they're very close. They're within a couple of generations to the people who will become the first farmers. And when we think about what it looks like the people at Goblet Tepe are doing, these don't look like people who are starving to death. These don't look like people who have an unsuccessful style of life. These are people who look like they're doing pretty good, who are quite happy with the way they live, and who may have made the choice that if we stay in one place year round, if we plant our own barley instead of only counting on the wild strands of it, we could make more beer more often, more frequently. And so it really does seem, at least based on Goblet Tepe, that beer may have been one of the reasons why the Neolithic began, why people first became farmers, thus leading to all of our culture today, all of civilization today, really just being an outgrowth of some people who wanted more beer. By the way, I just kind of want to mention this as a side shoot. A lot of people, if you are not if you never majored in archaeology, you kind of come away from high school or elementary school with the idea that farming only began in the Fertile Crescent. That is totally not true. Farming began in many different places all over the world. You can see some of them here. Now, what people began to farm differed in each one of these places based on what wild plants were available around them. So although the Fertile Crescent is where we see the ancestors of wheat and barley and rye, in other places, like in South America, is where we see the ancestors of things like potatoes and tomatoes. In Mexico is where we see the ancestors of things like corn. In North America is where we see the ancestors of things like sunflowers. I've already mentioned rice in China. In Papua New Guinea, we see the ancestors of things like bananas. So everybody is using whatever plants they had available in their region, but lots of people began to farm during the Neolithic, not just the people in the Fertile Crescent. So we have beer now, and let's look at how a couple of different cultures, ancient cultures, used beer among themselves. So let's first talk about Mesopotamia. Again, as I said, beer back in these days would have been unfiltered. It would have had still chunks of the grain in it. It would have had kind of mats of yeast floating in it. It would not have been kind of the clear, sparkly thing we think of as beer today. And so one of the ways as archaeologists we can really find quite clear evidence of beer is by looking for straws, because the earliest straws were always used for beer, and they were specifically used to filter out all of those chunks of other stuff, so you would just get the liquid and you wouldn't have to worry about, you know, choking on a piece or having to chew your beer. So here's one of our earliest written or drawn pieces of evidence for beer at 4000 BCE. And again, the reason why we know what these people are drinking is beer and not water or milk or whatever is because of these straws. This is the cuneiform for beer. As you can see, it starts out pretty clearly. It's a jug with lines in it. So that's a pretty obvious, you know, if you had to draw beer, that might be how you drew it. And as we move forward in time, though, it becomes more and more abstract until this becomes the cuneiform sign for beer. Much harder to just look at that and recognize what it is. But beer was very, very popular in Mesopotamia. Everybody drank beer from the top of society to the bottom of society. Here's an example of someone from the top of Mesopotamian society. This is a woman named Huabi, who was buried in the city of which is in modern day Iraq. We don't know exactly who Huabi was in her lifetime. Some people have called her a queen. Some people have called her a high priestess, but she's clearly someone who was very, very wealthy and probably therefore very, very powerful, because wealth and power tend to go together. And the reason we know she was very, very wealthy because she was buried with immense amounts of gold and silver and precious jewels. An entire chariot was placed in her grave. And in addition, she was actually buried with 52 servants who seem to have been killed specifically to accompany her into the afterlife. And if you have so much power that your one life outweighs the lives of 52 other people, clearly you are someone at the top of society. You are not someone obeying orders. You are not a servant to anyone. So this is just some of the elaborate jewelry and hairdress she was buried with. But in addition, she was also buried with several straws, which again, when we see straws in ancient Mesopotamia, we're always going to think beer. Here we have one straw that is all made out of gold that was left in a jug made out of silver. This is another straw. The tips were silver, and then the main body of the straw was made of alternating bands of gold and lapis lazuli. Lapis lazuli is a dark blue gemstone. And we also have Huabi seals. Seals were things that were used by important people in ancient Mesopotamia to kind of put their stamp on things. And on Huabi's seal, what it is clearly depicting is some people drinking beer, again, because we have these straws coming out of the jugs. And it seems like they're drinking beer at some kind of feast or ceremony or elaborate party, because down here we have someone who is playing an instrument, and we have some people who are dancing as well. So we see, again, beer being linked to some kind of festivity, just like it was in Goblet Tepe. But if Huabi is the top of Mesopotamian society, we also seem to have people at the bottom of Mesopotamian society drinking beer. This is a kind of jug called a spouted filter jug. And as you can see, these filters, these little holes, would have served the same effect as a straw. So you would put the beer in here, and then you would pour it out, and this little filter would act to keep the chunks back in the jug. But you might notice the handle is on the side, so it is not meant to be poured into a glass like most pitchers are today. It's not a handle on the back, but it's handle on the side, because whoever is using this is pouring it directly into their own mouth. In addition, another type of thing we find in Mesopotamian sites are these things called bevel-rimmed bowls. And we find these just in insane numbers at Mesopotamian sites, thousands at sites. They are mass produced. They clearly were cheap and disposable. You can kind of consider it almost the plastic bag of ancient Mesopotamia, just huge number of these. They're found thrown away everywhere. And what is interesting about these bevel-rimmed bowls is that they were used to measure out rations. So if someone at the top of society is someone like Queen Huabi, someone at the bottom of society was a servant or even an enslaved person who very often worked for a large warehouse. And instead of getting paid in money, they were paid in rations of food that were handed out and measured out in these bevel-rimmed bowls. So they would be handed out daily to the large numbers of the very, very lowest class of Mesopotamian society. And we know from the written records that some of the things put in these bevel-rimmed bowls was not just like flour or the oil you would need to cook it, but that beer was considered one of the fundamental things handed out in these bevel-rimmed bowls. Beer was considered a fundamental part of the daily rations that even the very, very, very lowest members of society had to be given. Unsurprisingly, because beer was so important to the Mesopotamians, they had a goddess of beer. Her name was Ninkasi. She was the goddess of brewing. She had 9 children who were named after the effects of alcohol, including a son called the Fighter, another son called the Boaster, and another one called He of Frightening Speech. And this is a hymn to Ninkasi that was written around the year 1800 BCE. And although it is a hymn to the goddess of brewing, it is also a recipe, which makes it the oldest recipe in the world. So how can something be a hymn to, how can it be both a hymn and a recipe? That's because it goes like, oh, Ninkasi, you who bring the barley. Oh, Ninkasi, you who mix the barley with the water. Oh, Ninkasi, you who adds the honey to the barley water. And I'm not going to read you guys the whole thing because it's very, very long, but it goes on like that. And although it's praising the goddess, it's also telling us the steps the people would take to make beer at this time in ancient Mesopotamia. So that means the oldest recipe in the world is a recipe for beer. Written around the same time, we also have the Code of Hammurabi, which you might have heard of. It's one of the oldest written sets of laws in the world. If you have heard the phrase an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that comes from the Code of Hammurabi. And some of the laws in this code include 4 laws that specifically relate to beer. So for instance, they say if a wine cellar charges more than the beer is worth, then that wine cellar has committed a crime. Another law is that if rebels meet in a tavern and the tavern owner doesn't report them to the palace, that tavern owner has committed a crime. So, if somebody is meeting in your bar and they're talking about overthrowing the government, you have to go and report them or else you're guilty too. So, laws don't seem that surprising. But what is really interesting is the Code of Hammurabi is written in a language called Akkadian. And Akkadian is a gendered language like French or Spanish today. When you say nouns, all nouns are either female or male. And the words they use for wine cellar and for tavern owner, they're all female words. In addition, Ninkasi, she is a goddess of brewing. She's not a god of brewing. And it seems that in ancient Mesopotamia, beer and the process of making beer and selling beer was very, very closely linked to women. It was seen as a women's job. Another story from ancient Mesopotamia concerns a woman named Kubaba. And Kubaba appears on a thing called the Sumerian king list. And this is a list supposedly of all the different kings who ruled in ancient Mesopotamia. The people at the beginning of the list are clearly mythological or clearly not real people. So for instance, one of the very first rulers supposedly was a guy named Alulim, and supposedly he ruled for 28,000 years. So clearly that's not real. Clearly no one ever lived for 28,000 years. However, the people at the end of the list are definitely real. They are people like Sargon of Akkad and his grandson Naram-Sin, people we know from a lot of other historical sources were real kings. Kubaba comes from right in the middle, where we're not quite sure. Maybe she's just a legend. Maybe she was a real person. It's hard to tell. But Kubaba's story goes that she lived in a city, and the king at the time was very corrupt. He was not a good king. And so the gods wanted to find someone to become a new king. So they looked all through the city, and the only person who was really good at heart and who did all the right prayers and who prayed to the god and honored the gods in the right way was this woman named Kubaba. So the gods made her the new king, not queen. They don't use the word that means wife of the king. They use the masculine word that means king, that means ruler. Kubaba is the only woman on the Sumerian kings list. And her job, supposedly before she became king, is that she was a tavern keeper. She brewed and sold beer. If she did really live, if she's not just a story, she lived around the year 2350 BCE. So there's this very, very heavy association in ancient Mesopotamia of beer of being a woman's task. And this is because beer and bread were very, very closely linked. They mostly had the same ingredients, and a lot of recipes would use them kind of interchangeably. So a lot of beer recipes, instead of starting with barley flour, they would just say, oh, take, if you have some leftover bread that's beginning to go stale, go ahead and use that to make beer. And vice versa, a lot of bread recipes, instead of using water, they would say, oh, just pour in some beer. And again, although the people of ancient Mesopotamia didn't know it, this would have been a very efficient way to keep the best strains of yeast going. Bread and beer were both things that were mostly made at home. You mostly didn't go out and buy bread and beer. You mostly had it made in your family, in your home kitchen. Kitchen was generally seen as a woman's area, and this is why women were so highly associated with making the beer. As we leave ancient Mesopotamia and go to ancient Egypt, we see the same thing. Women are very highly associated with beer, as are straws, as you can see in this piece of art. The goddess in Egypt of beer, it's also a goddess instead of a god. It is the goddess Hathor. You see her here. She is usually represented as a cow. You can see she has cow horns here. And she is the daughter of the sun god Ra. So she has a son here because she's the daughter of the sun. And the Egyptian myth about the beginning of beer goes like this. Ra, the sun, was beginning to get old, and he began to be suspicious that humans weren't taking care of him the way they should, that the humans might even want to take over, to dethrone him. So he told his daughter Hathor this, that he wanted her to punish humanity. And Hathor transformed from her normal state of being a cow, and cows are quite gentle and peaceful. And she transformed into her other form known as Sekhmet, which was a lioness. And as Sekhmet, she was the goddess of war and of revenge. So as a lioness, she sets out and she begins to kill all the humans. But she doesn't stop just at the ones that were doing bad things. She begins to kill everybody, all the humans on the whole world. And Ra gets worried, and he says, if you kill all the humans, there will be no one left to pray to us. There will be no one left to worship us. You've done enough, stop. But Sekhmet is so lost in the haze of battle that she can't hear him, and she just keeps killing. So Ra's like, I've got to figure out a way to make her stop. So he brews the very first beer. He brews 7,000 jars of it. He dyes it red, and he pours it all out into a field. So it makes this giant red lake. And Sekhmet comes by, and she sees this red lake, and she thinks it's a lake of blood because it's red. And she is quite literally bloodthirsty. So she stops and she drinks up this whole lake. And as you might imagine, after you drink an entire lake of beer, she got very, very sleepy. So she laid down and she went to sleep. And when she woke up, she no longer felt like killing people. She felt like just kind of staying there and not doing very much. So she stopped being a lioness and she transformed back into the peaceful cow Hathor state. And humanity was saved due to the invention of beer. And due to that, ever afterwards, Hathor was seen as the goddess of beer. Just like in ancient Mesopotamia, beer was seen as a very important ration you had to give out to working people. And some of the people who got this daily rations of beer were the people who built the pyramids. You might have heard the pyramids were built by slaves. That is not true. The pyramids were built by regular Egyptians who were paid for their labor. And one of the things they were paid in was beer. This is a bit of graffiti left behind by one of these groups of Egyptians who were working to build the pyramids. And they nicknamed their own little group the drunkards of Menkaure. Menkaure was the pharaoh at the time. Menkaure was the guy they were building this pyramid for. And they nicknamed themselves the drunkards of Menkaure. So clearly they had an appreciation for beer. This is the hieroglyph for beer. In addition to using beer as an important food, the ancient Egyptians also used beer as an ingredient in very, very many recipes. Particular recipes for medicine. And this does actually kind of make sense because alcohol is better for dissolving things into than water is. But despite that, most of these recipes, I don't know how much they would have actually worked. Let me tell you guys a couple of them. If you were bitten by a snake, you should grind up onions, put it in beer and drink that. If you were a pregnant woman who was having labor pains, you should mix saffron into beer and then have that massaged into the outside of your belly. That might feel nice, although I don't think the beer is what's doing the work there. And finally, if you had indigestion, you should take some powdered olives, mix that into beer and drink it. Which I have to say, I think would give me indigestion rather than curing indigestion. It is also in ancient Egypt that we begin to see beer and wine being distinguished into two different types of drink for the first time. Whereas we see here people making beer up on top here versus people making wine, obviously from the grapes, in this separate piece of art, where they're beginning to be separated out into two different things. And just like today, we also see some evidence of people in ancient Egypt occasionally overindulging in the beer, where we have here some people who have drunk to the point of passing out and are having to be carried home. And here we have a woman who is throwing up and her poor servant who is having to take care of her. Moving forward in time from ancient Egypt, we normally would next get to the Greeks and the Romans. But the Greeks and the Romans had very, very strong opinions about beer, and they were very negative opinions. They did not like beer. They saw it as a barbaric drink. They thought that the only good drink was wine. There was a Greek writer called Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who famously, describing the beer that was drunk by the people he called the Celts over here in what today is France and the UK, he described their beer as a foul-smelling liquor made from barley rotted in water. And I guess you could say barley fermenting in water. I guess you could call that rotting, but clearly he has a quite negative opinion of it. Another Greek writer talking again about the people here of Northern Europe, he claimed that they used their mustaches as filters, that instead of using straws, they used their mustaches to filter out the chunks. Which I have to, that seems like an exaggeration to me. The Greeks and the Romans definitely liked to make up stories about their enemies. And that seems to be one of the cases. In general, the ancient Greeks and the Romans actually believed that beer was an effeminate drink, and that if you wanted to be a good masculine Roman, you would drink wine instead. But it is beer that continued to be popular in Europe, throughout most of Europe, into the Middle Ages. But it still was beer that was quite different from the beer we drink today. And one of the biggest differences was what they used to flavor the beer. They used a mixture called gruit. And gruit was kind of like your grandmother's chicken soup. Everybody has their own recipe, and everybody's recipe is a little bit different from everybody else's. So gruit really could mean whatever you wanted it to mean. But the most common recipe for gruit was a mix of 3 herbs. The first was bog myrtle, which is described as tasting kind of like root beer or kind of like sassafras. The next is yarrow, which is described as having kind of an herbal taste, kind of like tarragon, if you guys are more familiar with that. And then rosemary, which you guys probably are more familiar with. If you aren't, rosemary has kind of like a piney taste. So a mix of these three were the most common flavorings in beer in Europe during the Middle Ages. So quite different flavor than what we think of beer having today. But again, this gruit really could involve anything, depending on where you were, depending on when you were, depending on what time of year it was. Some of the other things this gruit could have in it would be ginger, cinnamon, aniseed, which tastes like black licorice, dandelion, heather, coriander, or cilantro. In general, beer during the Middle Ages was very local. It was still mostly being made by women, mostly being made in the household. So it just really depended on what you had access to, what was locally available around you. And the local water also really influenced the taste of beer. Today, the water that is used to make beer, they strive to have it as neutral as possible so that it doesn't really have a lot of influence. But back in the Middle Ages, whether your local beer, whether it was very hard water or soft water, whether it had a lot of mineral compounds in it from the different local rock types, was it well water? Was it water coming out of a spring or a river or a lake? All of these differences would give a lot of very different tastes to the local beer. So if you were to travel around Europe during the Middle Ages tasting the different beers, you would find a huge variety from one place to another, from one village to another. One of the closest things we can get to tasting these medieval beers is a style of beer called gose. Traditional gose has a bit of a salty taste to it, and that is because this was traditionally a regional beer made in one part of Germany, and it happened that the water in this region had kind of a bit of salt in it. So gose made today, even if it's being brewed in Canada or America or the UK or wherever it is, they tend to put a bit of salt in it to try and capture that original taste. And a lot of goses today usually have either a coriander or a cilantro flavor. And again, that happens to be because coriander is what was used to flavor gruit, what was used to flavor beer in this one region of Germany. So we can kind of capture a little bit about the medieval styles of beers by trying goses. Like I said, just like in ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, it was mostly women's job to make this because, again, it was seen as just kind of liquid bread. It was a thing made mostly in the household. It didn't stay good for very long. It only stayed good for about a week. So you couldn't really make large supplies or you couldn't trade it very far. So it was a very local thing. For women, if they happened to make a bit extra, if they had made more than their family would be able to drink, before it went bad, because again, you only had about a week before it started to go bad, they would stick a pole outside their house with a bit of greenery wrapped around the pole. And that was a sign to any passerbys, whether it was their neighbor or whether it was a traveling merchant, that beer is available for sale in this house and you can come and get it. And then when the woman ran out of this extra beer, she would just take the pole down and that would be a sign, you know, there's no more for sale. This was a very common thing. An estimate is at least 3/4 of all houses in England would occasionally sell their homemade beer. And this was a very respectable way for women to make money, whether they were married, whether they were single, whether they were young, whether they were a widow. This was one of the few respectable ways women were able to make money. The women who did this were called alewives. And so we see quite a common representation of women selling beer in all sorts of varieties. And as I said, they would just do it out of their regular house. This is where the term pub comes from. It is short for public house or ordinary. And the original ones were literally just a regular house that was opened up. You were allowed to sit in the front yard or to sit into their kitchen and buy beer. You very often would have to bring your own mug or your own jar to consume it out of. You might even have to bring your own chair to sit in. This was not a professional bar or tavern or restaurant the way we think of them today. This was just, again, literally someone's house who was kind of having this side industry. But changes, as we get to the end of the Middle Ages, changes were beginning to come. And one of the biggest changes was hops. I mentioned hops at the beginning, that hops is one of the fundamental places beer today gets its flavor. But beer in the Middle Ages was not using hops. Beer in ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, none of these people were using hops. Hops are related to marijuana. This is what they look like. We actually use the flower, is the part of the plant we use, and they give the bitter taste to beer. They also, depending on what kind of hops it is, they can sometimes give kind of a floral taste or a citrusy taste. And they're also what makes beer really have its foamy head that we think of as such a common part of beer. So for a while, for several centuries there was this kind of battle between the people who brewed beer using gruit and the people who brewed beer using hops. And obviously it is hops that have won out. And there's a couple of reasons why hops were the one that won out. And a big one is because hops also has preservative properties. So as globalization as was beginning to happen, as people were beginning to travel, not just from village to village, but they were beginning to sail to the Americas, to Africa, to Asia, to Australia, they needed beer that would last for a longer time. And beer with hops in it was much more able to last for long periods of time than beer with gruit in it. Another reason why hops kind of won out is because gruit was older, the Catholic Church charged a tax on it. It didn't have any tax on gruit because gruit was a new thing, so no laws about gruit had been written yet. But as the Protestant Revolution began, and as more and more people became Protestants, they didn't want to pay a tax to the Catholic Church. So they turned to this new hops instead, and hops became very highly associated with the Protestants, and gruit became very highly associated with the Catholics. And there were many, many wars fought between the Catholics and the Protestants. This was a hugely important issue. And the Protestants very often began to spread rumors about gruit. They claimed that gruit was poisonous, even though people had been drinking it for centuries without a problem. They claimed also that gruit was an aphrodisiac. Now, we don't think of it today as that being a negative, but this was very often meant as a negative when the Protestants said it. They would say, you know, those Catholics, they drink the beer with gruit and they have too many babies. Whereas as Protestants, we drink the beer with hops and we're more sober-minded, we're more in control, we're more calm, and it's because of the hops. And in fact, hops today, if any of you guys are into herbal medicine, still today do supposedly have these kind of calming, sedative qualities. In fact, supposedly a cure for insomnia is to get a pillow stuffed with hops, and the scent of it is supposed to help you fall asleep. Another reason why hops ended up being the winner, though, is that as we're looking at the 1400s and the 1500s, beer production was beginning to move out of the household and into a more commercialized mass production type of way. People were beginning to form guilds of brewers, and the guilds very often were men only. Women were usually not allowed to join the guilds. And the guilds, part of the big push towards guilds was not just that you could make beer in bigger quantities, but that you could have standardized beer. So instead of beer tasting different in every single village and in every single household, when you went to a guild, you could trust that you would always get the same thing, that every single apprentice, every single journeyman who were trained by that guild, that they would all follow the same recipe and they would make the same kind of beer. And hops really lent itself to that standardization much more than gruit did, which had always been this kind of more changeable, more variable type of flavoring. And so hops did win out in the end. The very, very first use of hops was in the year 800 in this area, kind of what today is Belgium. And it would take till, as I said, about the 1500s when hops finally won out overall. And if you remember at the very beginning, I mentioned that 1516 Brevity purity law. That was part of this battle between hops and gruit. That purity law said only barley, water, and hops. No more gruit, none of this coriander, none of these cinnamon and aniseed and all this other stuff you guys are throwing in beer, only barley water and hops. So by 1516, we really have led in directly to modern beer. This, by the way, are some carvings on a Puritan church, carvings of hops on the church walls, really showing how much this hops became part of the Puritan identity and how important it was seen. It is also around the same time period, the early 1500s, that we get the first hard liquors. Hard liquors are distilled out of either beer or wine. And the idea of distilling goes all the way back to Aristotle. It was also known in ancient China, ancient India, the Mayas. A lot of people had figured out distilling. What distilling is basically is you heat a liquid and then you capture the steam and cool it back down. And by doing this, you're able to separate different components of that liquid. So a lot of these very, very earliest people, including Aristotle, what they used it for was to make seawater drinkable. So by boiling seawater and capturing the steam, you will end up with pure drinkable water because the salt is left behind. The salt doesn't turn into the steam. So that was what a lot of these early distillations were used for. Sometimes it was also used to do things like make essential oils or make perfumes. And it is not until around the 1500s that people, in this case, Europeans, got the idea of using it to make hard liquors. The first kind of alcohol to be distilled was wine. When wine is distilled, it becomes much, much higher APV, or alcohol by volume. And this distilled wine was called aqua vitae, which means water of life. And it was seen not as like a thing you just drink straight, but it was seen as a medicine. So you would only take like maybe 1 spoonful of it a day. You wouldn't be drinking whole glasses of it. But as it became more available and as it was beginning to be produced in larger numbers, it became more and more popular. It especially became popular in Northern Europe, where things like grapes, like even barley, quite hard to grow these grains the further north you get. It becomes too cold. And so these hard liquors were a way of transporting carbohydrates up from the regions where it was easy to grow fruits and grains up into the regions where grains were harder to come by, a way to transport carbohydrates. So in Scotland, in particular, this aqua vitae became the word usque vitae, which became today's whiskey. So from aqua vitae to usque to whiskey. This was distilled beer rather than wine, but basically the same process. Naturally fermented beverages, so things like wine, like beer, like mead, it's really impossible when you're only depending on yeast, can't really get above about 15% alcohol by volume. That's really the upper limit that is just biologically possible for yeast to make. But with distilling, you can really get up to about 100%. Everclear, for instance, which is the highest APV commercially available, is about 95%. So all hard liquors, vodka, gin, whiskey, rum, all of them are based on distilling these lower fermented alcohols. And they begin to become quite popular beginning in the 1500s onward. But another type of beer also begins to appear a little later, say in the 1600s. Oh, excuse me, I skipped a slide. And that is in England. Hops took a while to catch on in England. England was one of the last places to really like hops. The traditional British drink was a beer called porter, which does have some hops in it, but quite a low level of hops. It is a very, very sweet drink because of that, because we have that malted barley in it. And without the hops to add in a balance of flavor, it is a very, very sweet drink. It is also fairly low alcohol. It's a very thick drink. And beer, porters especially, was seen as this healthy drink. So you see, we've got all these nice, stout, thick-looking people in this picture. Beer was seen as a good source of energy, a good source of fuel. It especially was recommended for the working class. In fact, the drink porter gets its names from the job porter, from people who would carry heavy loads from one spot to another, because this was seen as a good drink for people who really used a lot of energy, who had to work very hard. Porter was also even recommended for pregnant and nursing women. It was seen as really giving them the energy and the strength they needed to grow a baby. So porter was the very, very popular drink in England in the 1600s and the 1700s. It was made out of a brown malt. So remember, malt is this barley, and it is brown because it has been roasted at high temperatures. And this is what gives porter its dark color. And because it has been roasted, that acts to stop the enzymes. So instead of converting all the starches to sugars, quite a lot of the starch remained starch. And that is why porter had low alcohol, and that's why it had this sweet, rich, thick taste. It also had kind of like a roasted or smoky flavor due to the roasting process. This roasting was done, depending on where you were, either over wood or over straw. But then in the 1700s, a thing called coke was invented. And coke was basically a refined version of coal. And brewers began to roast their barley over this coke instead of using wood or straw. And the advantages of coke is they were able to really control the temperature very, very precisely in a way you're not able to do with a wood fire. So instead of roasting their barley really at high temperatures, really extremely, and getting this kind of almost burnt dark malts, they started to get pale malts instead, because they could roast at low temperatures for a long time. Instead, they could roast very, very slowly. So they had these new pale ales that were very different from the previous porters. They were much higher in alcohol because they didn't have that effect of stopping the enzymes. So the yeast had a lot more sugar to work with, and they were much higher than alcohol. But because they didn't have that roasting, they didn't have a lot of flavor. It's kind of thinking about toast compared to plain bread. These porters had a lot more flavor than the pale ales did. And brewers would sometimes try to recreate the porter flavor by adding in sugar or by adding in molasses, or sometimes they even added in dangerous chemicals to try and recreate the old flavors. But by the 1700s and the 1800s, the taste began to change. And these pale ales, with their very dry, not sweet, not thick flavor, became more popular than the old porters. The porters were seen as still a good drink for like the working class, for the people who had to do the hard physical labor. But if you were middle class or if you were wealthy, you drank the pale ales. They were seen as pure because you could see through them. So they had this sense of being more pure than this old kind of thick drink that very often would leave dregs at the bottom of your glass. And another important change that happens around this time period is what people are drinking beer out of. People are beginning to drink it out of glass for the first time instead of out of pottery or out of horns or out of these other things where you can't really see the beer very well. When people begin to drink out of glass, especially the rich begin to drink out of glass, you can see the color and the clarity of the beer. And that begins to be a really important issue in the 1700s. And so these pale ales, these light sparkling colors become really, really popular. Also, beginning in the 1700s, Britain began to colonize India. And increasing numbers of British people were living in India, soldiers, clerks. And because it took so long to get from England to India, it took about 4 to 6 months just one way. People would not, they weren't going out on short vacations. When you, as a British person, went to India to serve as a colonizer, you were staying there for years, if not decades. And the British people in India, they wanted the comforts of home. They turned to locally available alcohols, One of the local alcohols in India was a thing called arak, which you can still get today. It's a distilled hard liquor. It can be distilled out of a lot of different things. Sometimes it's made out of sugar cane. It's often very commonly made out of coconut flowers. It can be made out of other fruits and grains, but because it's a distilled liquor, people very rarely drink it straight, the way you don't tend to drink a glass of rum, say. You mix it with things. And the most common way to mix it is what was called punch. When we think of punch today, we usually think of like a drink for kids, but the original punch was always alcoholic. In fact, the word punch comes from the Hindi panch, which means 5. And that is because punch usually had 5 ingredients. First, this arak, a hard distilled liquor, plus some water, some lime or lemon juice, some sugar, and a spice, most commonly nutmeg. So you mix those together. That's how you made the original punch based on this arak, this hard liquor. So the original punch was an extremely strong cocktail that would get you very drunk. But as British people spent more and more time in India, they didn't want to just drink this arak or this punch. They wanted the comforts of home. But the problem was, because it was such a long trip from England to India, it was hard for beers, especially those porters, to survive the journey. As I said, this journey took 4 to 6 months. It crossed the equator twice. So you're going from the relatively cool temperatures of England down through the tropics of the equator, all the way down south of the Cape of Good Hope, so pretty cold again, back up past the equator before you landed in Calcutta, which was the capital of British India. In addition, we're talking about sailing ships that would, in this 4 to 6 month journey, would very likely meet at least a couple of storms. The beers would be shaking up and down on the waves constantly. So something like a porter, very, very hard for it to survive this journey and still be drinkable at the end. So gradually throughout the late 1700s, brewers began to ship specifically pale ales and with higher and higher levels of hops. Because hops are a preservative, they helped the beer stay drinkable at the end of that long journey through these temperature extremes and through the movement. Sometimes these special pale ales that were being sent to India could have twice as much hops as the beer that was remaining back in England. But people began to like this new style of beer, this beer that was brewed specifically to be sent to India. And we began to see this style being sold not just in India, but being sold back in England as well. It had various names at the beginning. Sometimes it was called East India Pale Ale. Also saw Export India Pale Ale a lot. Sometimes it would have a long name, something like Pale Ale as prepared for India, or Pale Ale prepared for the East and West India climate. But it eventually became known as the IPA today, the India Pale Ale. So the India Pale Ale is distinguished by having this high level of hops, much, much greater hops than any other kind of beer, especially at the time, had. The India Pale Ales are one of the bitterest beers you can have because of that high level of hops. This is a chart ranking the bitterness of all different kinds of beers. And you can see this one here, right here, the highest one. This is a double IPA. So double IPA is even more hops than a regular IPA. These other ones next to it are other IPAs. These other high ones are all different kinds of IPAs. Where something like a gose, which is this traditional medieval beer, although goses today do have some hops in them, very, very low levels of hops and therefore of the bitter taste than something like an IPA. The IPAs fizzled out in popularity for a while in the late 1800s and the early 1900s until they came back in the 1980s, partly because a lot of the very earliest craft brew companies were based in the Pacific Northwest, so places like Oregon and Washington and Vancouver. And it just happens that hops grow really well in that area. And a lot of these companies like Sierra Nevada and Anchor Brew that really helped bring the IPA back into popularity use a particular strain of hops called Cascade hops, named after the Cascade Mountains, where they were first found to grow. So that's basically the end of my talk. I just want to take you guys on a super brief world tour on a couple of the other unusual styles of beer you can find worldwide. One is a beer called chicha, which you can find in South America and Central America. It was very important to the Incas. It is based on corn. The word chicha means to spit or to chew. And in fact, that is how chicha is traditionally made. People, again, you can see here, traditionally it is women, would chew up the grains of corn, spit it out, and use that mixture to brew into the chicha. And the reason why they did this is because they had to use corn, since there is no native barley to the Americas. By chewing it, enzymes in our saliva helped that process of changing it from starches to sugars so the yeast could get it. This, by the way, this is a picture of the founder of Dogfish Head Brewery, a guy named Sam Calgione. And this is an archaeologist named Patrick McGovern, who are chewing up their own purple corn for a chicha that Dogfish Head briefly made. They no longer sell it, but they did make their own chicha for a while. Another unusual beer is a one called kumis. This is made out of fermented horse milk. So milk also has sugars in it. And the way this would traditionally be made is you would milk your horse, you would put it in a leather bag on the side of your saddle, ride your horse all day, and the motion of the horse walking or galloping would churn up that milk. And by the end of the day, it would have fermented and become mildly alcoholic. This is recorded as being a very popular beer among the Scythians, who were a horse riding people in what today is kind of like Eastern Russia, Eastern Europe, that area. So this kumis, this fermented horse milk, was supposedly the favorite drink of people like Attila the Hun and Genghis Khan. It is also interesting because, again, from chemical analysis of some ancient pottery, we find milk, horse milk, being one of the earliest things being stored in the pottery in this area, which means beer, in this case, this kumis, this milk beer, may have also been one of the reasons why horses were first domesticated. In Australia, the Australian Aborigines also found some local plants they could use to ferment. In their case, they had no available wild barley in Australia. They had no available wild corn. They had no wild horses. So what they used was the sap of a tree called the cider gum. Apparently it has a very sugary sap they could ferment. And they also use these flowers called Banksia flowers, which has, as you can see, a whole bunch of little tiny petals. Each one of these petals has a little drop of nectar. So they apparently would just dunk the whole thing in water, and then the sugar water would ferment that way because nectar is just a kind of sugar. Apparently, another popular kind of beer that the Australian Aboriginal people made before the arrival of Europeans was a beer made out of ants. Just black house ants. It's the same species. If you guys have ever had ants in your house, same species. I have never tasted ant beer myself, but I found a review of it that a white man wrote for an Australian newspaper in 1923. He tried some of this traditional ant beer. He describes it. This drink had, of course, the taste and odor that are characteristic of squashed ants. It tasted slightly acid and thirst quenching. The ant mixture would not appeal to the European palate. The first mentioned beverage, the flowers, would probably prove not distasteful. So doesn't sound super appealing to me, but if any of you guys do want to taste an ant alcohol yourself, there is an Australian company which has made a gin flavored with green ants. So if you really want to taste an ant alcohol, you can order this gin online. Just called Australian Green Ant Gin, exactly the name you thought it would be called. So as you might have noticed, we've talked about almost everywhere in the world. We've talked about Africa, Asia, Europe, Australia, South and Central America, but we have not mentioned North America. And that is because it really does seem like there is no evidence for any kind of alcoholic drink in North America before Europeans arrived. But we've talked about all the many important purposes alcohol can serve in a culture, that it can serve as part of religion, as part of medicine, as part of trade, as a way to bring people together. And the people of North America did have a thing they used that served those functions. It just wasn't alcohol. What they used was tobacco. And in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, a new archaeological study came out where they had discovered used tobacco seeds was found on a site in Utah that dated back to 12,300 years ago. So quite long history of tobacco use in North America. That functioned much like alcohol did in a lot of the rest of the world. It had a place in religious rites, such as at the site of Cahokia. It had a place in diplomacy, such as in the famous war pipes and peace pipes. It was traded across long distances. It brought people together, but they used tobacco instead of alcohol. So that was the end of my talk. I saw Ali asked if the recording will be shared. I will have to throw it back to Kaylee to get that answer for you.
Yeah, if it's okay with you, we are going to put it on YouTube. So that's where it will be found. We are going to share it on our Facebook. So if you want to follow our Facebook, it's just Oklahoma Public Archaeology Network. You can find it there.
Does anybody have any other questions? Heather asked about pulque. That's true. Pulque, I definitely would call a beer. I should have said, rather than saying North America, I should have said north of Mexico, because we don't find pulque up in what today is the modern United States. We just find it in like Mexico and south of there. Does anybody have any other questions? Thank you, guys. I'm glad you had a good time. Thank you. This is my Twitter handle and email address if anybody thinks of questions later. I also have a mail list. I'll put it in the chat window here for you so you don't have to write it out yourself. If anybody wants to follow me and hear about other talks I'm doing in the future. John asks, is small beer with low alcohol as a safe alternative to water really prevalent? Small beer definitely was a real thing. It seems to mostly, it's called small beer because it had a very low alcohol level. It seems to have mostly been called that because it was very fresh. It hadn't had a long time to ferment. It is true that people drank much higher quantities of small beer than they drank of water. It's not always because the water was unsafe to drink. Throughout most of human history, a lot of populations would have been small enough that they could perfectly safely drink water. Even if they were, in a town near a river, the river wouldn't have been that polluted that it was dangerous. So it seems like people drank small beer mostly because they wanted to. And also it had these calories, it had vitamins, it had amino acids, it had protein in it. So it would be much more filling than drinking water would. It would taste better than drinking water would. And through most of human history, today, most people are always trying to cut their calories. Throughout most of human history, people were trying to get as many calories as possible. So by drinking small beer, it kind of would be like a liquid lunch. And that was really important to them, more so than avoiding bacteria would have been important to them. Tommy says, could have done without the image of chunky beer. I know. Doesn't sound super appetizing to me. Kathleen says, do you think the purity laws were made to favor the hops over the gruit? I definitely think that was a big part of it. This increasing attention towards food safety, towards standardization, that you wanted people to be able to trust what they were buying, that they weren't just getting things made out of someone's kitchen, and who knew what they were doing back there in the kitchen was also a big part of it as well. So there were these kind of cultural reasons. Bavaria was definitely a Puritan, not a Catholic area, but there also were these reasons that we might be more sympathetic to about we were trying to be more safe about what went into our food, and we were trying to help consumers to make better choices as well. Yeah, Will talks about manor brewing, second running. So using the same barley or whatever grain you were a second time was another way to get this low alcohol small beer that they could use for people who couldn't afford the high alcohol good stuff.
Okay, if there are no more questions, then everyone have a good night, and thank you, Patty.
Thank you for having me. It was a great time. I'm glad you guys enjoyed it.